I lived in Southern California in the mid to late 80s and then again in the mid 90s. During those years, I subscribed to the Los Angeles Times, which at that time was blessed with the presence of an exceptional number of really fine writers, columnists and critics whose work you looked forward to, sitting down over breakfast with the day's paper. They had strong voices and strong opinions clearly expressed, and with the best of them, you felt that each new restaurant or novel or album or artistic scene as it came along afforded them the opportunity not just to lay down judgment and flaunt their stylistic chops, but to test their own assumptions, to try the limits of their critical faculties, and most of all, to assert the primal importance of pleasure in the venture of being a critic. Our special guest today, Kristine McKenna, was one of those magical LA Times writers. Her beat back then was music writing, and through her restlessness and her enthusiasm and her sharp way with a sentence, I made so many discoveries that brought me so much lasting pleasure. Kristine is the author of a forthcoming biography of David Lynch, Room to Dream, which is due in February from Random House. And I'm very delighted and grateful to have the opportunity to welcome her to MacDowell today. Kristine.
There's no way I could speak as eloquently about David's work as Michael. Michael, you really hit it out of the ballpark. So I'm going to talk about David, the person. My story with David began in 1980. I saw Eraserhead and was blown away, like how could someone not be? And I tracked him down and he agreed to be interviewed. So we met at a coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard called Ben Frank's. And during that period in David's life, he spent a portion of every day in a coffee shop, basically looking at people. He's a very good observer. And that day he had a slice of lemon meringue pie and coffee, of course. And he seemed very shy and humble and quiet and unusual. So we stayed in touch, and I wrote something about him, and he seemed to like what I wrote. So after that, when people would contact him about wanting to do an article on him, he often suggested me as a writer. And when we met, he was working on The Elephant Man, and his next film, Dune, shot in Mexico. After that, all his films were shot in the U.S., and he always invited me to his sets. And I spent a week in Wilmington, North Carolina on the Blue Velvet set, and I really got to watch him work. And I have no idea why he was so nice to me, but he really was. Since we met, David's stature as an artist has grown steadily, and now there's a lot written about him. Really, I think there's hundreds of books and articles. And he's often complained about how much wrong information there is about him out there. So about 2.5 years ago, I said, David, why don't we write a book about your life that gets everything right? And he thought that was a good idea. And we wanted to have all the facts and figures of his life in there correctly, but I also felt it was important that his voice be a prominent part of the book. So we came up with an unusual structure. I would do a conventional chapter based on research and interviews, and David would read it, and then he would write a chapter in response to it. So he was kind of writing, he was responding to the way people saw him and what his experience of that personal part of his life was. So I did more than 100 interviews for the book. And in doing all that deep research on David, a really surprising thing happened. The closer I got, the better he looked. I think a big part of his brilliance is rooted in how loving he is and how much love he generates in the people around him. I can't count the people that said to me, I owe my career to David. He's just been really generous, and just as he's been generous to me, he gives people chances and There was one guy who was his driver on Twin Peaks, and 5 years later, the guy's got his own production company. David's really generous. So I'm going to close by reading 2 short excerpts from David's chapters in the book. The first one I chose because I think it gives a little bit of insight into one of the foundations of his work. And I should say, there's no way I can read these stories as well as he could tell them. He's a really good storyteller and very funny, but I'll do my best. That 50s small town thing, it's different, and to catch that mood is important. It's dreamy, that's what it is. The 50s mood isn't completely positive, though, and I always knew there was stuff going on. When I was out after dark and going around on my bike, some houses had lights on inside that were kind of warm, or I knew the people who lived in the house. Other houses, the lights were dim, and with some houses, they were almost out. There were lights on, but the house was dark, and I didn't know the people who lived there. And I get a feeling from these houses of stuff going on that wasn't happy. I didn't ever dwell on it, but I knew there were things going on behind those doors and windows. I was out one night with my brother, and we were down at the end of the street. Everything's lit up now, but in the 50s, in small towns like Boise, there were street lights, but they were dimmer, and it was much darker. It makes night much more magical because things just go into black. So we were down at the end of the street, and out of the darkness came this nude woman with white skin. Maybe it was something about the light and the way she came out of the darkness, but it seemed like her skin was the color of milk. And she had a bloodied mouth. She couldn't walk very well, and she was in bad shape, and she was completely naked. I'd never seen that before, and she was coming towards us, but not really seeing us. My brother started to cry, and she sat down on the curb. I wanted to help her, but I was young and didn't know what to do. I might have asked her, "You okay? What's wrong?" But she didn't say anything. She was scared and beat up, but even though she was traumatized, she was beautiful. Now, anybody who's seen Blue Velvet knows that happens in there. The second excerpt is from a chapter called Next Door to Dark. It covers the years between 1993 and 97, which is when he was making Lost Highway. I picked this because it gives a little glimpse of how David feels about show business, which is not great. And it's also a good example of how David talks about people. He has this image as kind of like a kooky dreamer off in dreamland, but he's actually a very astute observer of people, and he doesn't miss much. But the way he experiences people is always with compassion and affection and absolutely no judgment. And that's one of the things I love about him. So, okay. Around the time I was trying to get Lost Highway made, I was also trying to get this thing called Dream of the Bovine going. Dream of the Bovine is an absurd comedy, and although the script needs a lot of work, there are things in it I really like. Harry Dean Stanton and I went up to talk to Marlon Brando about the two of them doing it together, but Brando hated it. He looked me in the eye and said, "It's pretentious bullshit," and started telling us about these cookies made out of grass that grows in salt water that he wanted to promote. Then he told us about a car he wanted to build that had this bladder underneath that would cook this grass and make fuel, like the car would digest the grass. You could never tell if Marlon was putting you on or he was serious. The thing about Marlon was he just didn't give a shit about anything. Every business has bad behavior going on, but there's something about this business with all the egos and lies and backstabbings that makes you want to do something else rather than be in it. For sure, if anybody had that feeling, it was Brando. He played the game for a while, then he couldn't do it anymore because it just made him sick. And he'd reached a point where he just wanted to have fun. I think he was having fun, too. This was around the time he went on the Larry King show and kissed Larry King. He came up to the house a couple times. One time he came up by himself. I guess he'd driven himself, and he came in big, just big, being Brando in this house. It made me a little nervous because I didn't know why he was there or what we were supposed to do. I figured I'd make him a coffee, but right after he got here, he said, "So, you got anything to eat?" I thought, oh my God. But I said, "Marlon, I don't know. Let's go look." There was one tomato and one banana in the kitchen, and he said, "Okay, that'll do." So I got him a plate and a knife and a fork, and we sat down and started talking. Then he says, "You got any salt?" So he was salting the tomato and cutting it up and eating it while we were talking. Then Mary Sweeney, that was David's wife at the time, came in, and Brando says, "Mary, give me your hand. I want to give you a gift." So she put her hand out. He'd made a ring out of the Del Monte sticker that had been on the tomato, and he slipped it onto her finger. Marlon was dressing in drag now and then during that period. And the thing he really wanted to do was dress up as a woman and have Harry Dean dress up as a woman, and the two of them would have tea together and ad-lib while they were drinking tea. Think about that. It would have been incredible. All I'd have to do is turn the camera on, but Marlon chickened out. It drove me nuts. He should have done it. I showed Lost Highway to Brando after I finished it, but before it was released. We rented this theater and told the owner Brando was going to come by to see this film, and the theater owner was pretty pumped. So we get this thing set up, and Brando comes into the theater by himself, and they have all these treats out for him. He's got a burger with him, but he fills his pockets with candy anyway, and goes into the theater eating candy with his burger. He called me later and said, "It's a damn good film, but it won't make a nickel." It was good. He liked it. A lot of people thought Lost Highway wasn't a commercial choice, and I guess that's true. Siskel and Ebert gave it 2 thumbs down, so I got the guy at October Films to run a big ad that had an image of 2 thumbs down and text that read, "2 more great reasons to see Lost Highway." So I'm glad you're giving this medal to David because he deserves it. He's a great artist.